In 1889, a widow lost everything except a forgotten piece of land.
The rain hadn't stopped in 3 days when Verena Holloway stood alone beside her husband's grave, a folded letter trembling between her fingers. The ink had bled where the raindrops struck it, but 7 words still rose from the page like a warning carved into stone. If anything happens to me, run quick. Elias had written it the night before he died. The sheriff called it a hunting accident. Verena knew better. A man doesn't write a letter like that, then go shoot himself by mistake the next morning. 3 weeks later, the creditors came. They took the house. They took the cattle. They took the rocking chair her mother had given her on her wedding day. They even took the silver band off her finger, and when she asked to keep it, the man holding the ledger laughed. By the end of that summer, in 1889, Verena Holloway had exactly $15 left to her name, an old mule named Jericho, who refused to leave her side, and a tin box of seeds that had once belonged to a dead aunt nobody in Cedar Hollow was supposed to talk about. And when she walked into the land office that morning and laid those $15 on the counter, the men gathered around the stove laughed louder than the creditors ever had. They shouldn't have. The rain hadn't stopped in 3 days when Verena Holloway stood alone beside her husband's grave, a folded letter trembling between her fingers. The ink had bled where the raindrops struck it, but 7 words still rose from the page like a warning carved into stone. If anything happens to me, run quick. Elias had written it the night before he died. The sheriff called it a hunting accident, a man cleaning his rifle in the woods, a simple slip of the hand, case closed before the body had even gone cold. But Verena knew her husband. Elias Holloway had handled a rifle since he was 9 years old. He had hunted these Kentucky hills for 30 years without so much as a scraped knuckle. A man doesn't write a letter like that, then walk into the woods and shoot himself by mistake the next morning. A man like that gets killed. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside the lining of her coat close to her heart, where no thieving hand could find it. The grave was fresh. The dirt was still dark from the rain. There was no headstone yet. The county wouldn't allow one until the debts were paid, and Verena Holloway no longer had anything left to pay them with. She stood there for a long time. The wind moved through the cedar trees that gave the valley its name, and the sound was almost like a voice. She closed her eyes and listened. And in that moment, alone in the rain beside the man she had loved for 16 years, she made a promise. I will find out who did this to you, Elias. If it takes the rest of my life, I will find out. Then she turned away from the grave and walked back toward the road, where an old gray mule named Jericho stood, waiting in the mud, patient as the hills themselves. The creditors had come 3 days after the funeral. They came in a wagon, 4 men with hard faces and softer paperwork, and they read out the debts in a voice that sounded almost embarrassed. Elias Holloway, deceased, owed money to the Cedar Hollow Mercantile, to the Cumberland Feed Company, to a private lender by the name of Silas Drennan, whose grain warehouse loomed over the south end of town like a wooden fortress. The signatures on the notes were Elias's. Verena would have sworn that on a Bible. The loops of the letters, the slant of the pen, they were her husband's hand exactly, except for one small detail. Elias signed his name with a particular flourish at the end of the Y in Holloway. A little downward hook like a fishing line dropping into water. He had done it that way since he was a boy. Verena had teased him about it more than once. She had seen that signature thousands of times on every farm receipt and church register and family letter for 16 years. The signatures on those debt notes did not have the hook. She said nothing. She let the men read their papers. She let them walk through her house and tag everything she owned. The 4-poster bed her grandfather had built. The cast-iron stove her mother had sent down from Tennessee. The good china that had been a wedding gift from her Aunt Cordelia, the aunt nobody in Cedar Hollow was supposed to talk about. They took the cattle. They took the chickens. They took the rocking chair on the front porch where Elias had courted her on summer evenings, where he had sat beside her on the night their stillborn daughter was buried, where he had held her hand the morning he rode off to the woods and never came home. They even took her wedding ring. A man with a leather ledger asked for it. She slid it off her finger and laid it in his palm without a word. When she asked if she might keep it, just that one thing, the man laughed. The bare circle of pale skin where the ring had been felt colder than the rain. By the time the wagon rolled away, the house was empty. Verena stood in the middle of her own kitchen and listened to the silence. The fire had gone out. The walls felt thinner. The whole life she and Elias had built together had been folded up and hauled away on the back of someone else's cart. Only 3 things remained. The first was $15 hidden in a flour tin. The men had not thought to check money Verena had been saving since spring for the new winter coat she had never gotten around to buying. The second was Jericho. The old gray mule had been Elias's working animal for as long as anyone could remember. Elias had bought him as a half-grown colt and broken him to harness with his own hands. Jericho was old now, his muzzle white, his back swayed from years of pulling. But he stood at the fence post and watched the creditors with a look that was almost human. When one of them reached for his halter, Jericho laid back his ears and bared his teeth, and the man let go quickly. They left him behind. The third was a small tin box, no bigger than a Bible. Inside it were seeds, dozens of paper packets, each one labeled in a careful flowing hand. Beans, pumpkins, corn of 3 different varieties, tomatoes, squash, herbs Verena had never even heard of. The box had belonged to her Aunt Cordelia Threlkeld, the aunt who had died of fever in the summer of 1874, when Verena was 19 years old. The aunt nobody in Cedar Hollow would speak about above a whisper, even 15 years later. Verena lifted the tin from the back of the cupboard where she had hidden it. She held it against her chest for a long moment. Then she put it in her satchel, took Jericho's lead rope in her hand, and walked out of the house that no longer belonged to her. She did not look back. The town of Cedar Hollow sat at a bend in the river, where two roads crossed under a stand of black walnut trees. The land office was a square wooden building beside the general store with a potbelly stove in the corner and a tin roof that rattled when the wind picked up. Verena tied Jericho to the hitching post outside. She brushed the rain from her coat as best she could. Then she climbed the 3 wooden steps and pushed open the door. The smell of coffee and pipe tobacco hit her first. 4 men were gathered around the stove. The county clerk, Hensley Pratt, stood behind the counter with a wooden ledger open in front of him. Hensley was a small, nervous man in his 60s with thinning gray hair and ink-stained fingers. He looked up when Verena entered, and something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition. And something else. Something almost like pity. But there was a 5th man in the room. He stood apart from the others near the front window with a fine wool coat and a silver watch chain across his vest. He was tall, perhaps 50 years old, with dark hair going to iron at the temples, and a face that was almost handsome until you looked at the eyes. The eyes were too still, too watchful, like the eyes of a hawk on a high branch, waiting for something small to move in the grass below. Verena had never spoken to Silas Drennan in her life, but everyone in Cedar Hollow knew who he was. She walked to the counter and did not look at him. "Mr. Pratt," she said quietly, "I would like to see what land you have for sale." The men around the stove went still. The conversation stopped. One of them set his coffee cup down on the iron stove top with a small clink that seemed unnaturally loud. Hensley Pratt cleared his throat. "Mrs. Holloway, ma'am, I am right sorry about your husband, truly." "Thank you, Mr. Pratt. What land have you got?" The clerk hesitated. He glanced past her at Silas Drennan. Verena saw it, a flicker of the eyes lasting no more than half a second, but she saw it. "How much are you looking to spend, ma'am?" $15. The men around the stove laughed. It was a small laugh at first, almost polite. The kind of laugh men give when they think a woman has misunderstood the size of the world. Then one of them, a heavy-set fellow named Garrick with a tobacco-stained beard, slapped his knee and laughed louder. $15? He said. "Ma'am, you couldn't buy $15 worth of swamp with $15 in this county." "Hush now, Garrick," Hensley said, but the laughter kept on. 2 of the other men joined in. Even the youngest one, a thin clerk from the bank, who couldn't have been older than 25, smiled into his coffee cup. Verena did not move. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Hensley Pratt and waited. It was Silas Drennan who silenced them. He did not raise his voice. He did not move from his place by the window. He simply spoke in a tone so soft that the laughter died as quickly as if someone had snuffed a candle. "Let the lady look at the book, Hensley." The clerk's hands trembled slightly as he turned the ledger around. Verena watched his fingers move down the column of available parcels. Most of the entries were crossed out, sold, foreclosed, reverted to the bank. There were not many farms left in Cedar Hollow that had not been swallowed up by someone with deeper pockets than their owner. Hensley's finger stopped at the bottom of the page. "There is one," he said quietly. 3 acres. The old place out at the foot of the bluff. A small intake of breath came from one of the men by the stove. $15, Hensley said. The room went very quiet. Verena studied the entry in the ledger. The description was sparse. 3 acres at the base of a limestone bluff at the far western end of Cedar Hollow Valley. Limited road access. 1 cabin in disrepair. 1 spring of unknown origin. She looked up. "Why is it so cheap?" The young clerk by the stove answered before Hensley could speak. "Because nobody will live there, ma'am. They call it the haunted farm. Has been called that since before I was born." The men chuckled again, but this time the sound was different, thinner. The laughter of men who were not quite sure whether they themselves believed it. "Folks have tried," Garrick added. "More than a few. They don't stay. Livestock won't drink from the spring. Children won't go near the bluff. There's a mist that comes up off the water at night. Makes the whole place look like it's lit up from underneath. Like something burning down deep in the rocks." Verena listened. She did not speak. It was Silas Drennan who broke the silence. He had walked closer now, though she had not seen him move. He stood at the end of the counter, his fingers resting lightly on the wood. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. His voice was smooth and warm like good whiskey. "Forgive my saying so, but a woman alone in your circumstances, that is not a place where you want to make a home." Verena turned her head slowly and looked at him for the first time. She did not know this man. Not really. She had seen him at church a few times. She had seen him in town. Elias had mentioned him once or twice in passing. A grain buyer, a landowner, a man who held a great deal of paper in Cedar Hollow. But she remembered suddenly that one of the debt notes the creditors had read out had been signed over to Silas Drennan. And she remembered her husband's letter folded against her heart. "If anything happens to me, run quick." She held Silas Drennan's eyes for a long second. Then she looked back at the ledger. "I will take it," she said. She reached into her coat and laid the $15 on the counter, 1 folded bill at a time. Hensley Pratt's hands shook as he gathered them up. The men around the stove had stopped laughing entirely now. They watched her in silence, the way men watch a woman they had thought to be a small thing, and now suspect they may have misjudged. Silas Drennan said nothing, but Verena felt his eyes on her back as she signed the deed, as she folded the paper, as she tucked it inside her coat next to her husband's letter. When she turned to leave, she nearly walked straight into him. He was standing in her path close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his coat and the bay rum oil in his hair. "Mrs. Holloway," he said softly, "if you change your mind in a week or two, after you have seen the place, I would be willing to take that deed off your hands for $20, cash money, no questions asked. It took her a moment to understand what he was offering. He was offering her a $5 profit. He was offering her a way out. He was offering her too much. That was when she knew. Whatever was on that land, Silas Drennan wanted it. Wanted it badly enough to pay extra for it sight unseen. Wanted it badly enough to make the offer in front of witnesses just hours after a widow had spent the last of her money to buy it. "Thank you, Mr. Drennan," she said. "I will keep that in mind." She stepped around him and walked out of the land office. The bell above the door tinkled behind her. She was untying Jericho's lead rope when she heard the door open again. Quick footsteps. The smell of pipe tobacco and old paper. It was Hensley Pratt. The clerk had come out without his coat. He glanced over his shoulder at the closed door of the land office, then leaned in close. "Mrs. Holloway," he whispered, "I should not be saying this to you." Verena waited. "Your husband," Hensley said. "Elias, he came to see me about 2 weeks before he died." The cold that ran down Verena's spine had nothing to do with the rain. He wanted to buy that same parcel, the 3 acres, the haunted farm. Verena did not breathe. "I told him there were no funds the office could accept at that time. That was a lie, ma'am. I am sorry. I was told to tell him that by certain parties." "Which parties, Mr. Pratt?" The clerk's eyes flicked back toward the land office door. "I cannot say more, ma'am. I have a wife. I have grandchildren. But I will tell you this. Your husband knew something about that land. Something he was not supposed to know. And he was not the first." He pressed something into her palm, a small folded piece of paper. "Burn this after you read it," he whispered. Then he was gone, hurrying back up the steps and through the door before anyone could see he had been speaking to her. Verena stood in the rain for a long moment with the paper hidden in her fist. She did not unfold it. Not there. Not where anyone might be watching. She climbed into the seat of the old handcart she had used to bring her few remaining belongings, clucked her tongue to Jericho, and started down the road that led west out of town toward the limestone bluff at the far end of the valley. She did not look back until Cedar Hollow had disappeared behind the curve of the hills. Only then did she pull the paper from her fist and read what was written on it. There were just 3 lines in Hensley Pratt's careful clerk's hand. "Your aunt's name was on that deed in 1873. She was forced to sell. 6 months later, she was dead." The road to the haunted farm climbed slowly out of the valley and ran along the base of a ridge of limestone hills. Verena walked beside Jericho. The cart was light. There was not much left to pull. A bedroll, a cast-iron skillet, a wool blanket, the tin box of her aunt's seeds, a few jars of preserved beans she had hidden in the cellar before the creditors came. The rain had stopped. The sun was breaking through in places, sending long shafts of golden light slanting down through the trees. A red-tailed hawk circled high overhead, riding the wind. Verena walked and thought. She thought about her Aunt Cordelia. Cordelia Threlkeld had been her mother's older sister, a tall woman with iron-gray hair and a laugh like clear water running over stones. Verena's earliest memories were of summer afternoons in Cordelia's garden, the rows so neat and the plants so tall they had seemed to a small girl like a green city built just for her. Cordelia had not been like other women. She read books. She kept records. She wrote letters to professors at the Agricultural College in Lexington. She had been the first person in 3 counties to plant alfalfa, and she had been right about it when everyone else laughed. She did not trust rumor. She trusted evidence. She used to kneel beside a row of seedlings and crumble the soil between her fingers like she was reading a letter someone had written her. Most people look at the crop, she would say. They ought to be looking at the ground beneath it. And then she would tap the dirt with her knuckles and smile and add the thing she had said so many times that her niece could still hear the words in her own ears more than 15 years later. The land always tells the truth. Trouble is, most folks never stop talking long enough to hear it. Cordelia had died in the summer of 1874. The doctor said fever. There had been an epidemic that year in the lower counties. It had seemed reasonable at the time, but Verena's mother had cried for a week. Not the soft crying of grief, the hard, frightened crying of a woman who was afraid of something she could not say out loud. And she had taken Verena's hand one night, the night before the funeral, and said something that Verena had never quite understood. She knew too much, child. That is all I will say to you. Your aunt knew too much. Then Verena's mother had taken her to live in Tennessee with her father's people, and they had not come back to Cedar Hollow for many years. Not until Verena had married Elias Holloway and moved back as a young bride into a house her husband had built with his own hands on the eastern side of the valley, far from the limestone bluff. The land office paper crackled in Verena's pocket as she walked. Your aunt's name was on that deed in 1873. She was forced to sell. 6 months later, she was dead. The truth of it settled in Verena's chest like a cold stone. Her aunt had not died of fever, and her husband had not died in a hunting accident, and the haunted farm at the foot of the limestone bluff was not haunted at all. It was hiding something. The road ended at a sagging wooden gate. Beyond the gate, a narrow track wound between overgrown pastures toward a small cabin set against the base of a pale gray cliff. The cabin leaned slightly to one side, the way an old man leans when his back has finally given up on him. The roof was missing shingles. The chimney was crumbling. The front door hung half open. But Verena did not look at the cabin first. She looked at the spring. It came out of the limestone at the base of the bluff about 30 feet from the cabin. The water ran over pale rock and gathered in a shallow stone basin before slipping away into a small creek that wound down through the lower pasture. The light was beginning to fade. The sun had dropped behind the bluff, and in that pale evening light, The surface of the spring caught a color that Verena had never seen in water before. A faint shimmer of silver blue. It was not a glow. Not exactly. It was the way certain stones look when they are wet. The way a dragonfly's wing catches the light. The water was clear. It was simply that something in the stone or in the water itself threw back the dying sun in a shade that did not look quite like any other water in the valley. A thin curl of mist hung above the basin. Just a ribbon of pale vapor drifting up through the still air. Verena stood at the gate for a long moment and simply looked at it. So this is what they killed for, she thought. Jericho snorted softly behind her. The old mule pushed his nose against her shoulder. She put her hand on his neck. His coat was warm under her palm. "Come on, old man," she said. "Let us go see our new home." She opened the gate. Jericho followed her through without hesitation. He did not balk. He did not lay back his ears. He walked steadily down the track behind her, his hooves squelching in the soft ground. And when they came near the spring, the old mule did something Verena would remember for the rest of her life. He walked straight to the water. He lowered his white muzzle to the basin, and he drank. For half a minute, no sound but the wind in the cedar trees and the soft pull of an old mule drinking cold, clean water from a spring the valley had spent 20 years calling cursed. Verena watched him, and she thought about every story she had heard about this place. The livestock that supposedly refused to graze here. The mist that lit up the hollow on certain nights. The children who were warned to stay away. The valley had been afraid of something for a very long time. She knelt beside the basin. She cupped her hand and dipped it into the water. It was so cold it made her bones ache. She lifted it to her face. There was no smell of sulfur, no oily film, no stagnant rot. Only the clean stone scent of water that had traveled a long way underground through limestone. She brought it to her lips, and she drank. The water tasted of cold rock and nothing else. She waited. 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10. Nothing happened. The bluff above her remained silent. The spring kept flowing. The mist drifted up like a curl of pale breath in the dying light. And from somewhere up in the cedar trees, a whippoorwill began to call. Verena stood up slowly and looked at the cabin. "Well, Jericho," she said softly, "it looks like we are going to have to fix that roof before nightfall." The cabin was worse on the inside than the outside. A pack rat had been living in the rafters. The floor was warped from old leaks. The single window had no glass left in it, only a sagging piece of oilcloth that had rotted nearly through. The fireplace was full of ashes and one ancient bird's nest. But the walls were sound. The chimney, when she stuck her head into the firebox and looked up, was clear enough to draft. The hand pump at the back wall, when she worked the handle, eventually produced a brown trickle that ran clear after a minute. It was a roof. It was 4 walls. It was hers. She built a small fire from dry kindling she had brought in her cart and a few sticks she gathered from the yard. She heated water in her skillet. She ate cold cornbread and washed it down with hot tea brewed in a tin cup. When she had eaten, she opened her aunt's seed tin. She spread the packets out on the warped wooden floor in front of the fire. The labels were in Cordelia's own handwriting. Some of them were dated. The oldest was from 1869. The newest was from 1874, the year her aunt had died. Verena picked up one of the packets. Pumpkin seeds. The label read, Pumpkin, Connecticut Field, Spring Water Trial, CT 1874, Spring Water Trial. Verena sat very still on the floor of the cabin, holding the seed packet in her hand. She picked up another, then another. Beans, Kentucky Wonder, Spring Water Trial, CT 1874, Corn, Bloody Butcher, Spring Water Trial, CT 1874. Almost half of the packets bore the same notation. Spring Water Trial. Her aunt had been planting seeds at this farm, or planning to, the year she died. Verena began to understand. Cordelia Threlkeld had been a scientist in everything but the name, and her aunt had been studying something here. Something that grew differently with this water than it grew with any other. Something that someone had killed her to stop. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the whippoorwill called again. The mist rose silver blue from the spring under the rising moon. Verena Holloway gathered the seed packets carefully back into the tin. She closed the lid. She set the tin on the mantelpiece where the firelight could reach it. Then she sat down on her bedroll, pulled the wool blanket around her shoulders, and laid Elias's letter on the floor in front of her, smoothed flat with the palm of her hand. If anything happens to me, run quick. I am not going to run, Elias, she said quietly. I am sorry, but I am not going to run. She sat there for a long time and watched the fire burn down. The first 3 days passed in hard work. Verena patched the roof with cedar shakes she split herself from a fallen tree at the edge of the pasture. She nailed new oilcloth across the window. She swept out the pack rat's nest. She scrubbed the cabin floor with sand and lye. She mended the chimney with mud and chips of limestone she pried out of the bluff. Jericho watched her work. He grazed in the overgrown pasture. He drank from the spring whenever he was thirsty. He did not get sick. On the 4th morning, Verena walked the boundaries of the property. The farm was small. 3 acres, the deed had said, bordered on the west by the limestone bluff, on the north by a dry wash, on the south by the small creek that the spring fed. On the east, by a line of cedar trees that ran along an old split rail fence, half collapsed now. She walked the bluff line carefully, looking up at the gray stone. It rose perhaps 80 feet above the floor of the hollow, cracked and weathered, streaked with rust-colored stains where iron in the rock had bled down over the centuries. Here and there, small dark openings showed in the face, cave mouths or old erosion pockets. The bluff was honeycombed underneath the way most limestone country was. There were probably whole rivers running through the rock down there in the dark. She came at last to the place where the spring emerged. She crouched down beside it. She watched the water move over the stone, and she noticed something she had not noticed before. The basin was not natural. It was almost natural. Almost. But on one side of it, the stone had been cut. A straight line ran along the eastern edge of the pool. A line too straight to have been made by water. Someone long ago had taken a chisel to the limestone, smoothed it, squared it off. Why? Verena stood up slowly. She looked around the spring. She looked at the ground. There, half hidden under a patch of fern, a flat stone. Not a natural piece of the bluff. A flat slab, perhaps 2 feet square, set into the ground. She knelt and brushed the ferns aside. The stone had something carved into it, letters worn nearly smooth by years of rain and moss. She traced them with her fingertip. T, the initials, were her aunt's. Cordelia Threlkeld had been here, had carved her initials into this very stone, had been part of this place in some way that no one had ever told Verena about. She sat back on her heels and stared at the carving. A noise behind her, the soft sound of someone breathing. Verena turned. An old woman stood at the edge of the cedar trees. She was small and bent, with a face like a walnut and silver hair that hung in a long braid down her back. She wore a brown wool shawl over a faded blue dress. Her feet were bare. She was leaning on a hickory walking stick, and her eyes were not the eyes of a crazy woman, no matter what the valley had said about her for the last 15 years. Her eyes were sharp and clear and as gray as the limestone bluff itself. "You favor your mother," the old woman said. Verena rose slowly. Her heart was beating very hard. "I am sorry," she said. "I do not believe we have met." The old woman smiled. It was a small, weary smile. "No, child, we have not. Not since you were 4 years old. You were sitting on your Aunt Cordelia's lap. You had jam on your face." Verena could not breathe. "Who are you?" she whispered. The old woman shifted her weight on the hickory stick. "My name is Idabel Threlkeld," she said. "Most folks around here call me Granny Ida, the ones who still call me anything at all. The rest of them just call me crazy. Has been that way for 15 years now." She paused. She looked past Verena at the spring at the carved initials on the stone. Cordelia was my younger sister, she said quietly, which makes me your aunt too, Verena, your blood aunt, the last one you have got left in this world. The wind moved through the cedars. The spring whispered over the stone, and Verena Holloway, standing in the place where two women in her family had now made their stand, felt the first cold breath of how big this was going to be, how deep it ran, how far back. She looked at the old woman, at the eyes that were as clear as her own. They told me you were dead, Verena said. Granny Ida shook her head slowly. They told a lot of folks a lot of things, child, for a very long time. She stepped forward out from under the shadow of the cedars. The morning sun caught her silver braid and turned it almost white. Your Aunt Cordelia did not die of fever, she said, and your husband did not die of a slipped trigger, and this water you have been drinking has not killed you yet, has it? Verena shook her head. No, it has not. The old woman nodded. Then we have got a great deal to talk about, niece, and not much time to do it in. She turned and began to walk back toward the trees. Bring the mule, she said over her shoulder, and bring your aunt's seed tin. I have been waiting 15 years for someone to come back to this farm. I had begun to think no one ever would. Verena stood for a long moment beside the carved stone with her aunt's initials. Then she turned, called softly to Jericho, and followed the old woman into the cedars. Behind her, the silver-blue spring kept flowing out of the limestone as it had flowed for 10,000 years. And somewhere in the valley below, in a fine wool coat, with a silver watch chain across his vest, Silas Drennan was already writing the letter that would set the rest of it in motion. Granny Ida lived in a hut deeper in the cedars than Verena had ever guessed anyone could live. The path wound back through the trees for nearly a quarter mile, climbing along a fold in the bluff that was invisible from the cabin or the road. The hut itself was built into the rock. 3 walls of stacked stone, 1 wall of solid limestone cliff, a roof of cedar shakes weighted down with more stones, a chimney made from creek rocks set in mud and ash, a small garden plot in front dug into a pocket of black soil where the slope flattened out for a few yards. It was the kind of place a person built when they did not want to be found. It was the kind of place a person built when they were hiding. Verena tied Jericho to a young hickory at the edge of the clearing. The old mule lowered his head to crop the long grass. Granny Ida pushed open the rough plank door and went inside without a word. After a moment, Verena followed. The inside of the hut was dim and warm. A small fire burned in the stone hearth. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the rafters. A narrow rope bed stood against one wall. A table made from a single slab of cedar took up most of the floor. The table was covered in things that did not match the rest of the room. a brass surveyor's compass, a small leather-bound notebook, a magnifying glass on a black wooden handle, a row of glass vials in a wooden rack, each one stoppered with a tiny cork, each one labeled in a careful flowing hand. The hand was Cordelia Threlkeld's. Verena stood in the middle of the room and stared at the table. Granny Ida lowered herself slowly into a chair by the fire and laid the hickory stick across her knees. "Sit down, niece," she said. Verena sat. There was a second chair, smaller plane, with a worn leather seat. It looked like it had been waiting for her. For a long moment, the old woman did not speak. She watched the fire. The flames threw a small dance of light across her seamed face, and Verena saw for the first time that Granny Ida looked very tired. Not the tiredness of an old woman late in the afternoon. The tiredness of someone who had been holding a heavy weight for a very long time and was almost ready to set it down. "You want to know about your aunt?" Granny Ida said at last. "Yes, you want to know what happened to her and what happened to your husband." "Yes." Granny Ida nodded slowly. "Then I will tell you. But I want you to understand something first, child. The moment I tell you these things, you cannot unknow them. You cannot put them back. And the men who killed my sister are still in this valley. They are still drinking coffee at the stove in the land office. They are still standing in the pulpit on Sunday morning. They are still sitting on the bench at the county courthouse. Once you know what I know, they will come for you the same way they came for her, the same way they came for your Elias." Verena swallowed. Her throat was dry. "They have already come for me," she said quietly. "They have just not finished the job yet." The old woman looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "All right, then," she said. "All right." She got up slowly and crossed to the cedar table. She picked up the leather-bound notebook. She brought it back to the fire and laid it in Verena's lap. "Read it later," she said, "when you are alone. It is your aunt's, her field journal. I have kept it safe for 15 years. Verena's hands trembled as she rested them on the cover. The leather was soft with age. The corners were worn. "For now, I will tell you the short of it," Granny Ida said. "Your Aunt Cordelia did not study just plants. She studied the ground they grew in, the water that fed them, the rocks underneath. She had a friend over at the college in Lexington who sent her books. Geology books, mineralogy books. Things no woman in this county had any business reading the men around here would have said if they had known she was reading them at all." The old woman lowered herself into her chair again. In the spring of 1872, Cordelia took samples from the spring at the foot of the bluff. She had been watching that spring for years. She had been growing crops along it on a little piece she rented from the original owner, an old widower named Joseph Hatcher. Old Joe knew her. He knew she was a serious woman. He let her plant her experimental rose on his land for half the harvest. He thought it was a good bargain. So did she. Granny Ida paused. She found two things in that water, niece. The first was a particular kind of mineral wash. Limestone country water is full of all kinds of things, but this spring carried something special. Something that made the soil along the creek different from every other piece of soil for 50 miles. Crops grew bigger there, faster, stronger. She could not explain it all yet, but she could measure it. She had 3 full seasons of measurements by the spring of 1874, and the numbers told a story so clear that even a man at the agricultural college had written back to her and said, "Madam, if your records are accurate, you have got hold of something the entire state of Kentucky is going to want to know about." The fire popped in the hearth. "That was the first thing," Granny Ida said. "And it would have been enough by itself. Enough for a woman to make a name. Enough for her to buy that farm from old Joseph and live well on it the rest of her days." She looked up. Her gray eyes were as steady as stone. But she found a second thing, and the second thing was what killed her. Verena did not move. She did not breathe. In the bank of the creek about 50 yards below where the spring comes out of the bluff, my sister found a seam of clay. Pale, blue-gray, almost the color of the water itself in the right light. She dug some out and sent a sample to her friend at the college. He sent it on to a man in Cincinnati who knew about such things, and that man wrote back. Granny Ida reached into the pocket of her wool shawl and brought out a folded piece of paper. The paper was yellow with age. The folds were so worn that the creases had nearly worn through the page. She handed it to Verena. "This is the letter," she said. "Your aunt kept it. I have kept it since. Read it." Verena unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting was sharp and learned. The date at the top read May 1874. The letter was short. It was written by a man named Dr. Marcus Witzel of Cincinnati, Ohio. It addressed itself to Miss Cordelia Threlkeld of Cedar Hollow, Kentucky. "The sample you submitted," the letter said, "is kaolin clay of an unusually pure grade. The iron content is exceptionally low. The plasticity when wetted is excellent. If the deposit you describe is of significant size, you are sitting upon a material of extraordinary commercial value. Fine porcelain manufacturers in Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, and as far east as Trenton, New Jersey, would pay handsomely for a steady supply of this clay. I would urge you, madam, in the strongest possible terms, to file your mineral claim immediately. Speak of this discovery to no one. Such finds have, in my experience, often resulted in great trouble for the discoverer, if knowledge of them spreads before the legal claim is secured." Verena lowered the letter slowly to her lap. Her hands were shaking. "Kaolin clay," she whispered. "For making fine porcelain?" Granny Ida said. "Cups and saucers for rich folks in the East, bathroom fixtures, electrical insulators. They tell me now that there is electricity, a material that this country needs more of every year, and which is not found in many places. And here it was sitting under 3 acres at the bottom of a bluff in Cedar Hollow, Kentucky, underneath a piece of land that nobody wanted because they thought it was haunted. Verena thought of Silas Drennan standing in the land office, the careful, steady eyes, the smooth offer. I would be willing to take that deed off your hands for $20, cash money. He knew, she said softly. Silas Drennan knew. He has known since 1874, Granny Ida said. He was a young man then, a clerk at the courthouse. He had been working there for less than 2 years, but he heard things. Papers crossed his desk. Letters came through the mail. And he was a man who paid attention to anything that smelled like money. The old woman's voice grew quieter, harder. Cordelia had told one person about Dr. Witzel's letter. Just one. A young geologist named Henry Loomis, who had been helping her with her surveys. He was a good young man, a serious young man. He and my sister were going to file the claim together. They were going to be partners. There were even those who thought, given some time, they might have been more than that. Cordelia was 42 years old and never married. Henry Loomis was 30, but that is neither here nor there now. Granny Ida looked into the fire. 3 nights before they were to ride down to the county seat and file the claim, Henry Loomis disappeared. His horse came home alone. They found his hat in the woods near the bluff. They never found his body. Officially, he had been thrown by his horse and washed away in the creek. Officially. She drew a long breath. My sister came to me the next morning. She was white as flour. She told me what had happened. She told me Silas Drennan had been at the courthouse the day before and had asked her very politely whether she had been doing any prospecting recently. She had laughed it off. She had said no. But she knew Nice. She knew the moment Henry's horse came home empty-saddled. She knew who was behind it. Why did she not go to the law? Verena whispered. Granny Ida's mouth twisted. Who was the law in Cedar Hollow in 1874? The sheriff was old Bill Bramwell, Hollister Bramwell's daddy. He had taken money from Silas Drennan's daddy for 30 years. He would not have crossed that family for anything short of murder in front of 100 witnesses. The county judge was a man named Pruitt who drank too much whiskey and signed whatever was put in front of him for the right consideration. There was no law to go to child. Not the kind of law that would listen to a 42-year-old spinster making accusations against a respectable young clerk. What did she do? She came here, the old woman said, to this very hut. It was my husband's hunting cabin then. My Hiram had built it. He had passed 2 winters before. I was living alone in town. Cordelia came to me. She brought her notebook. She brought Dr. Witzel's letter. She brought every measurement she had ever taken from that spring. Granny Ida looked at the cedar table behind her, at the brass compass and the glass vials and the magnifying glass on its black wooden handle. She brought all of it. We hid it here. We agreed she would lay low for a few weeks, stop her work, let Drennan think she had given up. We would wait until the fall when his attention was on the grain harvest, and then we would slip down to Frankfort to the state capital itself and file the claim there, past the reach of the county courthouse. The fire crackled. She lasted 6 days. Verena closed her eyes. They poisoned her, Granny Ida said quietly. slowly, through the cider she bought at the mercantile. The man at the counter was a cousin of Drennan's. Nobody could prove anything. Cordelia took sick on a Tuesday. By Friday, she could not keep water down. By the next Wednesday, she was gone. The doctor wrote down fever. There was an epidemic that year in the lower counties. Nobody questioned it. She paused. Except me. The old woman raised her head. I went to my sister's funeral, niece. I stood beside her grave with your mother. And then I came home, and I packed every belonging I had into a single trunk, and I moved up here to this hut, and I let the valley start telling itself the story that I had lost my mind. Grief, they said at first, then strangeness, then madness. By the end of that first year, the children in Cedar Hollow were being told to throw rocks at the crazy old woman in the woods if they saw her on the road.
Which suited me just fine. A crazy old woman gets left alone. A crazy old woman does not get poisoned cider. A crazy old woman can keep her sister's papers safe for 15 years and wait for the right person to come along.
Verena opened her eyes. Her face was wet.
You waited,
she said. All this time, I waited, Granny Ida said. I knew old Joseph Hatcher would die eventually. I knew the farm would change hands. I knew Drennan would not buy it himself because he is not a fool. He knew folks would wonder why a rich man wanted 3 cursed acres at the foot of a bluff. So he let the place sit. He let the rumors do his work for him. He let owner after owner buy it cheap and lose their nerve and sell it cheaper. He has been waiting, niece, the same as me,
just waiting for the right kind of person to walk away from it for good. So he could pick it up at the courthouse auction for $2 and nobody would think twice.
The old woman's gray eyes hardened.
And then your Elias started asking questions.
Verena drew a slow breath.
Tell me, she said. Your husband was a sharp man, Granny Ida said. Sharper than most around here gave him credit for. About a year ago, he started buying horses at auction over in the next county. He went down to Frankfurt once or twice to look at the records office there. I do not know everything he found, but I know he found enough. He found old Joseph Hatcher's name on a deed transfer from 1873, with my sister's name beside his as a contract purchaser. He found my sister's death certificate. He found the date of Henry Loomis's disappearance. He started putting it together. She shook her head slowly. 2 weeks before he died, your Elias rode up here, right up this path. He had heard a story in town from an old drunk named Caleb Mott, who used to dig wells for a living and who had once told a tale about a clay seam in the Cedar Hollow Valley. Most people had laughed off old Caleb's stories years ago, but your husband took him seriously. He came up here looking for the crazy old woman in the woods because some part of him had figured out that the crazy old woman might know more than anybody else in the valley.
Verena pressed her hand against her mouth. I told him almost nothing, Granny Ida said softly. I am sorry, child. I am so sorry. I had been waiting 15 years, and I still did not trust him entirely. I told him only that the farm at the bluff was not what folks said it was, that there were men in town who would kill to keep it cheap, that he should not pursue it. He thanked me politely. He left. The old woman closed her eyes.
6 days later, he tried to buy it himself. They turned him away at the land office, and 6 days after that, they shot him in the woods and called it a hunting accident. The fire popped. A spark jumped onto the hearthstones and slowly died. Verena Holloway sat very still and let the truth of it settle into her bones. Her husband had not died because of his own foolishness. He had died because he had been one step away from breaking open something that 3 powerful men had spent 15 years burying. She lifted her head. "You said 3 men?" she said. "Tell me." Granny Ida nodded. "Silas Drennan is the head," she said. "It was his money and his hand from the start, but he could not have done it alone. Not the killings, not the cover-up, not the long, quiet wait. He had to have 2 other men in the valley, men who could move pieces of paper in the right ways, men whose word the rest of the county would never question." She held up one finger. "Hollister Bramwell, our county judge, son of the sheriff who never investigated my sister's death. A man who has signed every land transfer in this valley for the last 20 years. A man who held the pen that wrote your husband's death certificate." A second finger. "And the Reverend Obadiah Kerr, pastor of the Cedar Hollow Methodist Church. The man who buried my sister with words about the will of the Lord. The man who buried your Elias with the same words. The man who has been Silas Drennan's first cousin on his mother's side since the day he was born, though most folks have forgotten that connection because the names are different." Verena's blood went cold. Obadiah Kerr had been Elias's friend since boyhood. Elias had stood up for him at his wedding. The Reverend had baptized their stillborn daughter. He had prayed beside their bed when Elias had pneumonia in the winter of 1885. He had held Verena's hand at her husband's funeral and told her that God had a plan she could not yet see. Granny Ida watched her face. "I know, niece," she said softly. "I know. He has worn that smile of his for 40 years. There is not a soul in Cedar Hollow who suspects him, and that is exactly what makes him the most dangerous of the 3. Verena could not speak. The old woman reached out and laid one thin hand on her wrist. "That is why I waited," she said. "That is why I let them call me crazy for 15 years, because the people who killed my sister are not just one man. They are 3 men, and they are the 3 men who hold the power of money and law and God in this little valley. To bring them down, niece, we are going to need every piece of evidence we have got, and we are going to need the patience to use it at exactly the right moment." She squeezed Verena's wrist once, then she let go. "You have the farm now," she said, "which means you have the spring, and you have the clay, and in that journal in your lap, you have the proof. Not just of what is in the ground, but of who has known about it and for how long,
and what they have done to keep it secret. Verena looked down at the leather notebook in her lap. She did not open it. Not yet. "What do I do?" she whispered. Granny Ida smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who had been waiting 15 years to give an answer to that question. "You do what your aunt was going to do, niece. You plant your crops. You measure your harvest. You let the valley see that the haunted farm is not haunted at all. You become so successful and so visible that Silas Drennan cannot make you disappear without every newspaper in the state asking why. And while you are doing all of that, you and I are going to quietly, carefully gather every last scrap of proof your aunt left behind. And when the time is right, we are not going to give it to Hollister Bramwell. We are not going to give it to the Cedar Hollow Sheriff. We are going to send it past them, to Frankfurt, to the governor's office itself." Verena drew a long, slow breath. For the first time since she had stood in the rain beside her husband's grave, she felt something other than grief or rage moving in her chest. It felt almost like hope. "All right," she said quietly. "All right." The weeks that followed were the strangest of Verena Holloway's life. By day, she was a widow learning to farm 3 small acres at the foot of a bluff. She prepared 2 test plots, the way Cordelia's journal taught her, the way Aunt Maribel had taught her as a child long before that. 1 plot beside the spring, 1 plot on the higher ground, the same seeds, the same week, the same depth, the same spacing. She wrote everything down in a fresh ledger of her own. In handwriting she made deliberately plain, so that no one looking over her shoulder would mistake it for the careful, flowing script of her dead aunt. She let people see her work. She let the wagons that occasionally rattled past on the road glimpse a widow in a faded dress hoeing rows of beans, hauling buckets of water, mending fence. A pitiful sight. A foolish woman with no idea what she had bought. By night, she was someone else entirely. She walked the 1/4 mile through the cedars to Granny Ida's hut. She and the old woman sat at the cedar table by lamplight and read through Cordelia Threlkeld's notebook, 1 page at a time. Soil measurements, water flow rates, temperature readings taken before dawn and after sundown, the growth records of 3 full seasons of crops, and the maps. Cordelia had drawn the clay seam in delicate brown ink. It ran along the creek bank in a shape like a long, crooked finger, narrow at the spring end, broader as it went south. The widest part of the seam, Cordelia had calculated, sat directly beneath the lower pasture of the farm. The pasture Verena now owned. The clay deposit was enormous. In a margin note dated June of 1874, in handwriting that grew increasingly uneven as the page went on, Cordelia had written, "If my measurements are correct, this seam alone could supply 3 porcelain works for 20 years. The value of the land properly developed would exceed $200,000 at minimum. $200,000. In 1889, $200,000 was a fortune almost beyond imagining. It was the wealth of a man who owned banks. It was the wealth of a railroad president. For a woman who had just stood in a land office and laid down 15 wrinkled dollars on the counter, the figure was so large it did not feel like a number anymore. It felt like a sentence of death. Granny Ida watched her face by lamplight. "Now you see, niece," the old woman said softly. "Now you see why my sister died." Verena closed the notebook. "And why Elias did," she said. The crops grew. The first weeks were tense. Some of the seedlings near the spring had trouble at first, just as Verena had begun to fear. A few of the bean plants curled their leaves. A few of the young pumpkins paled at the edges. She had been overwatering. The mineral content of the spring was rich enough that pouring it on heavily the way she would pour rainwater was too much for tender roots. She adjusted. She mixed the spring water with rainwater from a barrel behind the cabin. She poured less often. The plants responded almost overnight. By the middle of summer, the difference between the two test plots had become impossible to deny. The corn beside the spring stood thicker and a deeper green than any corn Verena had ever grown in her life. The beans climbed their stakes ferociously and kept climbing. The pumpkin vines spread across the ground in heavy green waves, and when the first pumpkins began to set, they were already bigger than Verena's two fists held together. And then the boy came. His name was Wesley Brackett. He was 12 years old, the son of a trapper who ran a long line of snares along the creeks at the western end of the valley. Wes had been crossing the lower edge of Verena's property one morning, checking a snare that had been set near the fence line, when he stopped in the middle of the path and simply stared. Verena saw him from the cabin. She walked down to meet him. The boy looked at her with wide eyes. He was small for his age. His hair was the color of wheat straw. His clothes were patched. He had no shoes. "Ma'am," he said, "what in the name of all that is holy did you do to this place?" Verena smiled a small smile. "Just planted a garden," she said. Wes looked at the corn. He looked at the pumpkins. He looked at the bean rows climbing higher than his head. "That ain't a garden, ma'am," he said. "That is something else." By noon, he was back in Cedar Hollow. By sundown, the whole valley had heard. The first visitors came 2 days later. They came in 2s and 3s. Men with their thumbs hooked into their suspenders. Women shading their eyes. Children leaning on the fence rails. They walked through the rows. They picked at the leaves. They stared at the pumpkins, which by then were nearly the size of bushel baskets. An old farmer named Ephraim Vale was among them. Ephraim was 80 years old. He had farmed every kind of ground in Cedar Hollow for 60 years. He took out a pocket knife. He cut a piece of pumpkin. He chewed it slowly. He swallowed. He looked at the rows of crops stretching toward the limestone bluff. In 60 years of working this valley, he said quietly, I have not tasted a harvest like this one. The visitors murmured, and Verena, watching their faces, saw exactly the thing Granny Ida had told her to watch for. She saw the moment when the story began to change. The moment when the haunted farm began to become something else. But she also saw, at the very back of the small crowd, a man she had not invited and had not expected to see. He was leaning against a hickory post at the edge of the road. He wore a fine wool coat. A silver watch chain glinted across his vest. Silas Drennan did not come into the field. He simply stood at the road and watched. When his eyes met Verena's across the heads of the visitors, he tipped his hat to her very slightly. The way a hunter tips his hat to a deer he has decided will be his. Then he turned and walked back toward his horse. Verena watched him go. The next day, the trouble started. The trouble was small at first. The Cedar Hollow Mercantile, owned by a man named Merritt Cole, had been taking Verena's produce on consignment for 2 weeks. The arrangement was simple. Verena hauled in a wagon load. Merritt sold it. Merritt took a small cut. The rest came back to Verena in cash money the following Saturday. The first 2 Saturdays, the money came back fat with sales. The third Saturday, Merritt met her at the loading dock with a face the color of old wax. "Verena," he said. He did not meet her eyes. "I cannot take any more of your produce just now." She stood very still on the seat of her cart. "Why not Merritt?" "There has been talk," he said. "Folks coming in, saying things. A few of the regular customers said they would not buy here if I kept selling your stuff." "What kind of talk?" Merritt Cole was a decent man. He had known Verena Holloway since she was a bride. He had liked her husband. He did not want to be standing on this loading dock having this conversation. "They say the food is making children sick," he said quietly. "They say a little boy out on the Branham place broke out in hives after eating one of your tomatoes. They say a woman over in Three Forks lost her unborn baby last week, and the only thing different in her diet had been your beans." Verena's hands tightened on the reins. "Is any of that true, Merritt? I do not know Verena. Has anyone asked a doctor? Verena. Has anyone shown you a sick child, a grieving mother, anyone at all?" Merritt Cole looked at the floorboards. "It is just talk, Verena, but talk is what runs a store like mine. I cannot afford to keep selling if my regulars walk out the door." She sat there for a long moment. Then she clucked her tongue to Jericho and turned the cart around and drove home without another word. 2 days later, the barn fire started. It was the small barn at the back of the property, the one Verena had been slowly patching up to store hay in. She woke up at 3 a.m. to Jericho braying frantically in the pasture. By the time she got outside, the back wall was already engulfed.
She managed to drag her plow and her newly mended harness out the front before the roof caved in. The fire burned itself out against the limestone bluff at dawn. In the soft earth at the edge of the burn pile, 3 sets of boot prints came in from the road and went out the same way. The next week, her hand pump at the cabin began to bring up bitter water. Verena tasted it once and spat. She knew the taste. It was the taste of the tonic Silas Drennan had once left as a gift. She stopped using the pump entirely and carried all her water from the spring. The week after that, the Reverend Obadiah Kerr came to call. Verena saw him coming down the road on his neat brown gelding. She had been bracing for this visit for weeks. She made herself open the cabin door. She made herself stand on the porch with her hands clasped at her waist. She made herself smile. "Reverend," she said. He climbed down from his horse. He removed his black hat and held it against his chest. He was 60 years old, a tall, lean man with kind brown eyes and a soft voice that had soothed half the dying in Cedar Hollow for the last 4 decades. "Verena Holloway," he said gently. "Forgive me for not coming sooner." He climbed her porch steps. He took her hands in both of his. "I have been worried for you, child." She let him take her hands. She let him sit with her at the small plank table she had built outside the cabin. She let him drink the cup of cold spring water she poured for him, which he drank without hesitation, with a small smile, like a man saying, "See, I am not afraid of your water. I am your friend." He talked for an hour. He talked about her late husband. He talked about scripture. He talked about the unfair stories spreading through Cedar Hollow about her crops. He shook his head sadly over them. He said, "There are wicked tongues in this valley, sister, and the Lord will judge them in time." Then he said the thing he had ridden out to say. "Verena," he said softly, "I am worried about your safety. A woman alone far from town with people saying ugly things. If anything were to happen to you, those papers your dear aunt left behind, the journals, the notebooks, the records your husband had been keeping, they could be lost, stolen, burned in an accident, God forbid. Would you let me take them for safekeeping? I would lock them in the church vestry. No one would ever know they were there." Verena lowered her eyes. She looked at her hands folded in her lap. She let 2 seconds pass, then 3. "Reverend," she said, "I will think on it." He patted her shoulder. "That is all I ask, sister. Pray on it." He left 20 minutes later. Verena stood on her porch and watched him ride down the road. She watched him until the road bent around the curve of the bluff and his brown horse was gone. Then she went inside and tied a kerchief over her hair and walked the 1/4 mile to Granny Ida's hut. The next morning, before dawn,
She saddled Jericho with the old work harness and rode him along the back trails to a high ridge that overlooked the Cedar Hollow Road. She tied him in a stand of pines and crawled to the edge of the ridge with a battered spyglass Cordelia had once used to watch hawks. She watched the road for 2 hours. At a few minutes after 9 o'clock, the Reverend Obadiah Kerr rode out of town on his brown gelding.
He did not turn east toward his home. He did not turn south toward the homes of his parishioners. He turned north, down the long, flat road that led to the great wooden grain warehouse of Silas Drennan. Verena watched him ride straight to the warehouse. She watched Silas Drennan come out to meet him at the loading dock. She watched the two men shake hands and disappear inside together. She lowered the spyglass. She lay flat on the cold ground at the top of the ridge and pressed her face into her arms. For a long moment, she did not move. She had known. Granny Ida had told her. She had even half expected this very thing. But knowing was one thing. Seeing was another. The man who had baptized her stillborn daughter. The man who had prayed beside her husband's deathbed. The man who had taken her hands in both of his only the day before and called her sister. A liar from the day she had met him. A liar from the day Elias had met him when both of them were boys of 10 years old, throwing rocks at a tin can in a churchyard a lifetime ago. A liar from the very beginning. Verena Holloway lay on the cold ground at the top of the ridge, and she did not weep. She did not weep because she had run out of tears for weak men. She had used them all up on her husband's grave. There were none left for the Reverend Obadiah Kerr. She crawled back to Jericho. She mounted up. She rode back down the trail toward her 3 acres at the foot of the bluff. And somewhere in the part of her heart where her husband had once lived, a small, hard fire began to burn. It was a different fire than grief. It was a different fire than fear. It was the fire of a woman who had finally seen all 3 faces of the thing that was hunting her, and had decided in that moment that she was going to hunt it back. That night, she stood up to put the kettle on for tea, and a sound came from outside the cabin. A boot scraping on the porch step. Verena did not freeze. She crossed 3 quick, silent strides to the corner, where Granny Ida's old shotgun stood loaded against the wall. She had the breech open and the shells in her hand before the cabin door began to move. The cabin door cracked open 3 inches. Verena slid the second shell into the breech and snapped the gun closed without a sound. She had practiced the motion every night for 2 weeks. She raised the shotgun to her shoulder. She thumbed back both hammers. The door pushed inward another inch. A voice came through the gap. A boy's voice, thin and scared and trying very hard not to be. "Mrs. Holloway, ma'am, please don't shoot." She did not lower the gun. "Step into the light," she said. Slow,
The door eased open. A small figure slipped through the gap and stopped just inside the threshold with his hands held up at his ears. Wesley Brackett, the trapper's boy. His wheat-colored hair was wet from the dew on the cedars. His feet were bare. His face was streaked with what looked like dirt, but turned out, when the firelight caught it, to be the dried tracks of tears. Verena lowered the shotgun slowly. She did not put it down. "Boy," she said, "what in God's name are you doing at my cabin at this hour?" Wesley's chin trembled. He pressed his lips together hard. "My mama," he whispered. "She is took bad sick, ma'am. The water in our well went dry 3 days ago. Daddy has been hauling from the creek, but the creek is half mud now. Mama can't keep nothing down. The doctor said she needs clean water or he ain't going to make it through the week." The boy's voice broke on the last word. Verena set the shotgun against the wall. "How far?" she said. 2 miles, up the West Fork." "You ran 2 miles, barefoot, in the dark." He nodded. She crossed the room and knelt in front of him and took both his thin shoulders in her hands. "Wesley Brackett," she said, "you hold steady for me 1 minute. We will get your mama her water. But first, I need you to tell me one thing, and I need you to tell me the truth, son. Do you understand me?" He nodded again. His eyes were enormous. "Why did you come to me?" she said. "Of all the wells in Cedar Hollow that have not gone dry, why mine?" Wesley swallowed. "Because everybody else's well has gone dry too, ma'am. Or just about. The whole valley is drying up. Mr. Drennan has water at the warehouse, but he is selling it for $1 a bucket, and Daddy ain't got $1. $1 a bucket." Verena stood up slowly. She had known the drought was bad. She had seen the creek shrink. She had watched the corn in the upper plot begin to suffer, while the rows along the spring kept growing. She had not known working her 3 acres at the foot of the bluff just how bad things had gotten in the valley below. $1 a bucket for water. In a valley where most families did not see $1 in cash money from 1 week to the next. She drew a long, slow breath. "Wesley," she said, "I want you to do exactly what I tell you." He nodded. "I want you to go out behind the cabin. There is a smaller water cart back there, the wooden one with the iron-banded wheels. I want you to hitch it to the rope on Jericho's halter. Jericho will let you. He is gentle. You hitch the cart to the mule. I will fill the 2 big oak barrels from the spring. We are going to take water to your mama, tonight, right now. Do you hear me?" The boy's eyes filled. "Yes, ma'am. Go on." He flew out the door. Verena stood in the middle of her cabin for a moment. Then she picked up the shotgun, broke the breech, removed the shells, set the gun back in the corner, and went out into the night to fill her barrels. She did not get back from the Brackett place until almost dawn. The boy's mother was a woman not much older than Verena herself, lying in a tick bed in a small log house, with 2 younger children pressed against her side. She drank a full ladle of spring water before she even opened her eyes. When she opened them and saw Verena, she began to cry, and she could not stop crying. And her husband, a thin, grim man named Tobias Brackett, simply stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and did not say a word.
Tobias followed Verena out to the cart when she was getting ready to leave. He stood beside Jericho with his hat still in his hands. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. She turned. "Ma'am, there is something I need to tell you. I should have told it before now. I have been a coward." She waited. Tobias Brackett looked at the ground. "The night your husband died," he said, "I was running a line of snares up near the saddle of the bluff. About an hour before sundown, I heard voices. 3 men. They was coming up the trail from the south. I went still in the brush. I was downwind. They did not see me." Verena's hand closed tight on the rope of Jericho's halter. "It was Silas Drennan," Tobias said quietly, "and the Reverend Kerr, and a 3rd man I did not know, a big man in a city coat. They went on up past me, toward the high meadow where they was supposed to be hunting, where your Elias was." He swallowed hard. "I heard the shot, ma'am, half an hour later. I knew it weren't no hunting shot. A hunting shot you hear the man call out after. Or you hear 2 shots if he missed and shot again. You don't hear 1 shot and then nothing. I heard 1 shot, and then nothing. And then I heard them 3 come back down the trail past me faster than they had gone up." Tobias raised his eyes. They were wet. "I knew Mrs. Holloway. I knew that night. I have known for half a year. And I never said a word because Silas Drennan owns the note on this place I am standing on. And I have got 3 babies in that bed in there. And he told me once that if I ever spoke an unkind word about him in this valley, he would foreclose on me by Wednesday morning." He drew a shuddering breath. "My wife is going to live because of you, ma'am. I would have let her die before I asked Silas Drennan for $1 of his water. But you I will speak for, in any court, in front of any man. I will tell what I heard that night on the bluff trail, and I will sign my name to it. I do not care what he does to me after." Verena stood very still in the gray light of approaching dawn. The 3rd witness, the thing they had been missing. For weeks, she and Granny Ida had whispered in the lamplight about how to break Silas Drennan. They had the geology. They had Cordelia's notebook. They had the unfiled mineral claim from 1872. They had the forged signatures on the debt notes against Elias, which an honest handwriting expert could match against a genuine signature in 10 minutes. They had Dr. Witzel's letter. What they had not had was a living human being who could put Silas Drennan in the woods on the day Elias Holloway died. Until now. Verena reached out slowly and laid her hand on Tobias Brackett's forearm. "Mr. Brackett," she said, "I am going to ask you a question. I want you to understand, before you answer it, that the answer may change the rest of your life." He nodded. "Will you sign a sworn statement of what you heard?" in writing, with a witness, and let me carry that statement to a man I am going to write to in Frankfurt, the governor's lawyer. Tobias Brackett did not hesitate. Yes, ma'am. Then we will come back this afternoon, she said quietly. Granny Ida and me, and we will write it down together. And you will put your name to it, and then you will go back inside this house, and you will not speak of it to a living soul until I send for you. Yes, ma'am. She climbed up into the cart. She drove home through the rising dawn with the empty barrels rattling behind her. And for the first time since she had stood beside her husband's grave, she felt the shape of a finished plan beginning to settle into place in her chest. 3 witnesses: the boy who could tell about the drought and the $1 a bucket, the trapper who could put 3 men in the woods on the day of the killing, the Reverend himself if she could break him. She had been working on that 3rd piece for 2 weeks now, carefully, patiently. By every appearance she had been growing softer toward Obadiah Kerr since his visit. She had ridden into town the Sunday after he came to call. She had sat in the front pew of his church. She had cried during the sermon, which was not difficult because the sermon had been about widows and the goodness of the Lord. She had let the Reverend take her hand at the door of the church and tell her that he was praying for her. She had let him think she was breaking. She had even sent him a note 3 days ago by way of the boy who carried mail. The note was short. Reverend Kerr, I have thought on what you said. I am ready to bring the papers. Please come to the cabin Friday at dusk, and I will hand them over to you. I cannot carry this any longer. Verena Holloway. Today was Friday. The trap was nearly ready. The drought had done what no amount of evidence could do by itself. The drought had given Verena the moral ground she needed to stand on. By the 3rd week of August, the creeks in Cedar Hollow were beds of cracked mud. The good wells had dropped 20 feet. The Cumberland River itself, down at the southern end of the valley, was the lowest anyone had seen it in 30 years. Cattle were dying in the lower pastures. 2 children in the upper hollows had already died of the bloody flux from drinking standing water. And the silver blue spring at the foot of Verena Holloway's limestone bluff kept flowing, the same steady cold flow it had run for 10,000 years. Word spread, first the Brackett family, then a neighbor of theirs who had heard, then a cousin of that neighbor. By the end of the 1st week, families were riding out to the haunted farm with empty barrels in their wagons, hats in their hands, eyes downcast. Verena gave water to every one of them. She did not take a cent. She did not take a chicken in trade. She did not take a sack of meal. She did not take a promise. She simply walked them to the spring with their barrels and helped them fill and shook their hands and told them to come back when they ran low. Some of them had been the people who had laughed loudest at her in the land office. She gave them water with the same hands she gave it to anyone else. She did not make a single word of speech about it. She did not have to. By the 2nd week, Silas Drennan's water trade had collapsed.
No one would pay him $1 a bucket when a widow at the foot of the bluff was filling barrels for free. By the 3rd week, the valley had stopped using the words haunted farm entirely. They had started using a new name, the Spring Place. It was that week that Wesley Brackett began coming to the farm every morning. He came on his own. He did not ask permission. He simply appeared at sunup barefoot with a hoe over his shoulder. He worked the rows with Verena until noon. He ate cornbread with her on the porch. He hauled water buckets for the families who came in the afternoons. Verena watched him. He was a quick child. He noticed things. He asked sharp questions about why the corn near the spring stood taller than the corn on the rise. He asked why Jericho would walk into the spring water but balk at the muddy creek. He squinted at the limestone bluff and asked one afternoon whether Verena had ever been inside the small cave openings that pocked the rock face. She had not, she said, and she did not want him to either. He nodded gravely and went back to hoeing. On the 4th morning he came, he set his hoe down at midday and looked at her across the porch step where they were eating their cornbread. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. "Yes, Wesley." "My daddy told me what he told you, about the bluff trail, about the night Mr. Holloway died." Verena set her cornbread down. "Did he?" "Yes, ma'am. He told me last night. He said he wanted me to know on account of I am the oldest boy, and if anything happens to him, I will be the man of the house, and I need to know what kind of men live in this valley." The boy looked at his bare feet. They were brown with the dust of the road. "Mrs. Holloway, I have got something to tell you too." Verena waited. She did not breathe. "The night before your husband died," Wesley said quietly, "I was running my own snare line down along the creek, way down in the south end, near where Mr. Drennan's warehouse backs up to the water. I had a rabbit in a snare, and I was getting it out, and I heard voices come out of the back of the warehouse, the little door at the loading bay." He swallowed. "It was Mr. Drennan and the Reverend Kerr. They did not see me. I was down in the willows on the bank. I was 11 years old, and I was scared, so I just got still. They was talking about your husband, ma'am. They was saying his name. They was saying he had been asking questions at the courthouse in Lexington. They was saying he had gone too far. And Mr. Drennan said the words, the exact words. He said, 'Well then, it will have to be tomorrow morning at the high meadow.' And the Reverend said, 'Are you sure that is wise?' And Mr. Drennan said the Reverend can preach the funeral. People will accept it from the Reverend." Wesley raised his eyes. "I went home, ma'am. I did not tell nobody. I was 11 years old, and I knew if I told what I heard, my whole family would get burned out by sundown. I told myself it was a dream. I told myself I had heard it wrong. I told myself for 6 months. And then my daddy told me what he heard the next day on the bluff trail, and I knew I had not heard it wrong at all." The boy began to cry. It was a quiet crying. He did not move his hands to his face. He did not sob. He simply sat on the porch step and let the tears run down through the dust on his cheeks. "Ma'am," he said, "I would like to put my name on a paper too, the same as my daddy. I do not care what they do to me. I have been carrying it for half a year, and I cannot carry it no more." Verena Holloway reached out and gathered the boy against her shoulder. She held him while he cried. Over his head, she looked out across the rows of green crops and the silver-blue spring at the foot of the bluff and the limestone cliffs beyond, and she thought of her husband and of her Aunt Cordelia and of all the years a small valley in Kentucky had lived under the weight of 3 men's lies. That night, in the warm yellow circle of the kerosene lamp at Granny Ida's cedar table, the 3 of them composed the letter to Frankfurt. Granny Ida wrote it in her own clear schoolmistress hand. Cordelia had taught her sister to write that way. The script was easy to read. The pages were numbered in the upper right corner. The facts were laid out in order. The witnesses were named. The geology was explained. The forged signatures on the debt notes were compared against 3 genuine Elias Holloway signatures gathered from old farm receipts. Dr. Witzel's 1874 letter was copied out word for word, with the original folded carefully into the envelope as proof. The unfiled mineral claim of Cordelia Threlkeld and Henry Loomis was included, signed, and dated June 12, 1874, 3 days before Henry Loomis disappeared. The sworn statement of Tobias Brackett, witnessing 3 men on the Bluff Trail on the morning Elias Holloway was shot, was attached. The sworn statement of Wesley Brackett, age 12, overhearing 2 men plan a killing the night before it occurred, was attached. Verena's own account of Silas Drennan's offer at the land office, his visit with the poisoned tonic, the barn fire, the contaminated well, and the Reverend Kerr's request for her aunt's papers was attached. The whole packet was nearly an inch thick. The letter was addressed to the governor's office at Frankfurt by name. It was addressed simultaneously in a second sealed copy to a newspaper editor in Louisville, whose name Cordelia Threlkeld had once underlined in a letter from 1874 as a man who could be trusted to print the truth no matter the cost. The 2 packets went out at dawn the next morning, carried by Tobias Brackett himself, who rode the long way south to a railhead 2 counties over, where no one in Cedar Hollow would see him hand them to the postmaster. Now there was only Friday left. The Reverend Obadiah Kerr came at dusk. He came on his neat brown gelding. He wore his black coat and his black hat. He carried a small leather satchel in which he had told Verena he had brought a Bible and a candle so that the handing over of the papers might be done as a kind of solemn occasion, so that her dear aunt's memory might be honored. He tied his horse to the porch rail. He climbed the 3 wooden steps. He removed his hat and held it against his chest. He smiled, the kindest smile in Cedar Hollow. "Verena," he said softly. Sister, I am so glad you have found your way to peace. She did not smile back. She had not slept the night before. She had spent the night going over every word she meant to say to him. She had decided finally that she would say very few of them. She opened the door for him without speaking. He stepped inside. The cabin was lit by 2 lamps. The wooden table in the center of the room held a stack of papers tied with brown twine. Beside the papers sat a single tin cup full of spring water. 2 plain wooden chairs faced each other across the table. The Reverend Kerr smiled again. He set his hat on the table. He set his leather satchel beside it. He sat down in the chair facing the door. He did not see the loft. Verena had built the loft herself 3 months before. It was a small storage platform above the back wall of the cabin, reached by a narrow ladder. The opening to it was concealed by a heavy wool blanket Verena had tacked across the rafters as if to insulate the room. Behind that blanket, in absolute silence, 4 people were sitting. Granny Ida Threlkeld with her field journal and a sharp pencil. Tobias Brackett with his old hunting knife at his belt and a long oak walking staff across his knees. Hensley Pratt, the county clerk from the land office, who had finally crossed over to Verena's side 3 nights before, when she had walked into his back room with Cordelia's mineral claim in her hand and laid it on his ledger and said quietly, Hensley, I am giving you 1 chance to be on the right side of this when it is over. And Wesley Brackett, with a pencil of his own and a clean sheet of paper across his lap, taking down every word that was said below in the careful schoolboy print he had been practicing all week. Verena sat down across from the Reverend. Reverend Kerr, she said. Yes, sister. Before I hand you these papers, I want to ask you a question. He folded his hands on the table, the kindest smile. Of course, child. Ask me anything. Reverend, did you know my husband Elias was going to die the morning he died? For half a second the smile did not move. Then it adjusted itself. Sister Verena, what a strange and painful thing to ask. Please answer it, Reverend. He shook his head slowly. Verena, the death of your husband was a tragedy, a terrible accident. I felt it as deeply as if he had been my own brother. I would no more have foreseen such a thing than I would have foreseen the sun rising in the west. Verena sat very still. Reverend, she said, I have 1 more question, and then you may have the papers. Anything. On the night of June the 11th of this year, the night before my husband was killed, were you at the back loading door of Silas Drennan's grain warehouse, talking to Mr. Drennan about my husband going too far? The smile finally died. It died slowly the way a candle dies when someone is pinching out the wick. That is an extraordinary accusation, Verena. Yes, Reverend, it is. She did not move. The Reverend Kerr looked at her face for a long moment. Something in his eyes shifted. Calculation. Recalculation. He decided in that moment that she was alone and that there were no witnesses. and that she was a woman of 34 whose husband was dead and who had no one in the world but a crazy old woman in the woods. He decided wrong. "Verena," he said. His voice was lower now. The kindness was gone from it. "Listen to me carefully, child. You are very tired. You are grieving. You have been told things by Granny Ida that come from a mind that has not been right since 1874. You have built up a story in your head, but you have no proof of anything. I have a great deal of proof, Reverend." "You have nothing. A widow's word against the word of 3 of the most respected men in this county. You have a crazy woman and a trapper who owes Silas Drennan $300 on a foreclosure note. You have a 12-year-old boy who could not tell you the time of day from a sundial." Verena raised her eyebrows slightly. The Reverend Kerr did not notice. He had begun to lean forward across the table. "I will tell you what you have, Verena. You have a choice. You can hand me those papers tonight, all of them. The journal, the Dr. Whitzel letter, the Threlkeld mineral claim, all of it. And in return, you will keep this farm. You will keep your life. You will keep your good name. I will see to it personally. The story of your aunt and your husband will be quietly forgotten. The valley will move on. You will marry again in time. You will have children. You will live to be a grandmother." He paused. "Or you can refuse." He paused again longer. "And I cannot answer for what happens next. There are men in this valley who have lost their patience with you, Verena. I have been the only one holding them back. There was talk 3 nights ago that you might suffer an accident in your barn. The same kind of accident that took your husband. There was talk that the spring might be poisoned in such a way that the families who have been coming for water might begin to sicken. There was talk of much worse things than that." He laid his hand flat on the table. "I have argued for mercy, sister. I have argued that you are only a woman who has lost too much already. But my arguments will not hold forever. You must give me the papers tonight, all of them. And you must give me your word that you will speak no more of any of this, ever. And I will save you." The cabin was very quiet. Outside, a whippoorwill called in the dusk. Up in the loft behind the wool blanket, Wesley Brackett's pencil scratched once and then was still. Verena Holloway looked across the table at the Reverend Obadiah Kerr, at the man who had baptized her stillborn baby, at the man who had stood beside her at her husband's grave, at the man who had just confessed in his own voice, in his own words, to threats and to poisoning and to the murder of Elias Holloway. She drew a long, slow breath. "Reverend Kerr," she said quietly, "there is one more thing I have to tell you before I answer you." He waited. "My Aunt Cordelia is buried in the Threlkeld plot at the Methodist churchyard. You know the plot. You buried her there." He nodded warily. "Beside her there is a marker stone with no name, no body underneath, just a stone. My grandfather put it there in 1874. He said it was for the second daughter he had lost, because he believed both his daughters had died that summer. He never knew Granny Ida was alive. Verena leaned forward very slightly. Reverend, when I came home tonight before you got here, I went to the churchyard. I sat by that marker stone, and I made a promise to my aunt. I told her that the men who killed her were going to hear their own voices read out in a court of law before the snow falls this year, by a circuit judge sent down from Frankfurt. Not by Hollister Bramwell, by a real judge with a real jury from outside this valley. The Reverend Kerr had gone very still. I made her another promise, Verena said. I promised her that I would not lay a hand on any of you myself, that I would not poison your cider the way you poisoned hers, that I would not burn your house the way you burned my barn, that I would not stand outside your door in the dark with a shotgun the way 3 men stood outside mine. She paused, because she would not have wanted that. My aunt was a scientist, Reverend. She believed in evidence. So do I. She stood up slowly from the table. The Reverend Kerr stared up at her. For the first time, fear moved into his face. What have you done? He whispered. I have been writing letters, Reverend, Verena said softly. I have been writing them for 3 weeks. They are in Frankfurt now. They are in Louisville. They are in a vault at the Citizens Bank of Lexington. They are sealed in 3 places that none of you can reach, and one of those copies will be opened next Tuesday morning by an attorney for the governor of the state of Kentucky. She paused. And there is one more thing. She turned her head slightly toward the wool blanket above the back wall of the cabin. Granny Ida, she said quietly. Hensley, Tobias, Wesley, will you come down, please? The blanket pulled back. 4 faces looked down out of the loft. The Reverend Obadiah Kerr made a small sound. It was not quite a word. It was the sound a man makes when the ground he has been standing on for 40 years suddenly is not there anymore. Granny Ida came down the ladder first. Then Hensley Pratt with the inkpot still in his hand, the cap unscrewed, ink drying on his thumb, where he had been taking notes of his own. Then Tobias Brackett, who set his oak staff against the wall and looked at the Reverend with an expression that did not need any words. Then Wesley, who climbed down last with 3 full pages of careful schoolboy print held against his chest. The Reverend stood up. He looked toward the door. Tobias Brackett moved between him and the door. Sit down, Reverend, Tobias said quietly. We are going to wait here until sunrise. The sheriff from the next county over is coming at first light. He is a friend of Hensley's cousin. He is bringing 2 deputies and a warrant signed in Frankfurt 3 days ago. We are going to give you a chair to sit in until he gets here. We are going to give you water if you are thirsty. But you are not leaving this cabin. The Reverend Obadiah Kerr sat down. He did not say anything for a long time. Then, very quietly, he began to weep. He wept the way an old man weeps when he has finally been seen. Verena Holloway watched him weep, and she did not feel triumph, and she did not feel pity. She felt only the steady, cold, clean feeling of a job that was now nearly done. Granny Ida came and stood beside her and laid one thin hand on her arm. "Your aunt would be very proud of you, niece," the old woman said softly. Verena nodded.
She could not speak. The next 3 months passed quickly, the way the last hard miles of a long road pass quickly when you can see the lights of home at the end of them. The sheriff from the next county came at sunrise as promised. The Reverend Obadiah Kerr was taken into custody without resistance. By noon that same day, 2 state marshals down from Frankfort had arrested Silas Drennan at his grain warehouse. They found him sitting at his desk, going over the September ledgers. He did not run. He looked up at them with the same still hawk eyes he had once turned on Verena across a land office counter, and he simply nodded once, as if he had been expecting them for 15 years, and stood up and put on his coat. Judge Hollister Bramwell was arrested at his bench in the courthouse in the middle of a hearing. The Frankfort marshals did not even let him gather his papers. He was led out in front of 3 lawyers and a courtroom full of farmers, and the silence in the room when he passed through it was the silence of a valley letting out a breath it had been holding for too long. The trial was held in November in the county seat to the south before a circuit judge sent down from Lexington. The Reverend Kerr broke entirely on the second day. He confessed in open court to the forging of Elias Holloway's debt notes, to the planning of his murder with Silas Drennan, to the false burial of Cordelia Threlkeld, with full knowledge of how she had died, and to the disappearance of the young geologist Henry Loomis in the spring of 1874. He named the man who had been hired by Silas Drennan to fire the shot in the woods on the Bluff Trail. That man was arrested in Missouri the following week and brought back in chains. Silas Drennan said almost nothing through the entire trial. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in the state penitentiary at Frankfort. He died there 4 years later of a chest cold in a cell that overlooked the prison vegetable garden. The Reverend Obadiah Kerr received 20 years for his testimony. He died in his sleep before he had served 8. Judge Hollister Bramwell was disbarred and imprisoned for 10 years. When he came home to Cedar Hollow at the age of 75, no one would speak to him on the street. He moved to Missouri to live with a niece and was not heard from again. Cordelia Threlkeld's mineral claim was recognized as valid by the state of Kentucky. The kaolin clay seam was confirmed to be one of the richest deposits east of the Mississippi. A representative from a porcelain works in Trenton, New Jersey, came down in person to make Verena Holloway an offer of $190,000 cash for the rights to mine it. Verena Holloway refused. She refused again the following spring, when a Pittsburgh firm offered $220,000. She refused for the rest of her life. The clay stayed in the ground. She told her aunt's old field journal when she wrote in it for the first time herself in the spring of 1890 that some things are worth more in the ground than out of it. A valley that is left alone
is a valley that stays alive. She wrote that the spring would keep flowing for 10,000 more years if the clay was never disturbed. She wrote that $200,000 would not bring her husband back, nor her aunt, nor the young man named Henry Loomis, whose bones were never found. She wrote that there were many things in this world more valuable than money, and that her aunt had died to teach her one of them. She closed the journal. She put it in the tin box with the seeds. She put the tin box on the mantelpiece where her grandchildren in time would learn to leave it alone. She married Jonah Pike in the spring of 1890. He was a stone worker who had come to Cedar Hollow to build the new dam on the Cumberland River, and had stayed to repair the irrigation channels at the spring place. He was a quiet man, a widower. He had hands like worn oak. He understood that the spring place would always belong in the deepest part of Verena's heart to a woman who had walked out of a land office one rainy morning with $15 in her pocket and an old mule on a lead rope. He did not try to be the center of her story. He stood beside it. He helped her plant. He helped her teach. Granny Adabel Threlkeld died peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1891 in the small hut among the cedars where she had hidden for 16 years. Verena buried her on the high ground above the spring beside the empty stone marker that had once stood for her in the Methodist churchyard. The marker was moved up to the farm. A second stone was placed next to it. The two stones stood side by side, the two Threlkeld sisters together at last, looking down across the green fields that Cordelia had begun and that Verena had finished. The valley healed slowly. 23 years went by. It is now the spring of 1912. The new century has come. There are automobiles on the main road down through Cedar Hollow, though they are still rare enough that the children run to the porch rails to watch them go by. The new electric lights have come to the town. The first telephone line was strung last year. But out at the spring place beneath the limestone bluff, time has moved more gently. The spring still flows. It runs cold and clear and silver blue under the sun. Bees from a dozen hives along the bluff drift through the orchard that Jonah Pike planted in their first year together. The orchard is heavy with bloom. In the side pasture, a small group of children is sitting in a half circle in the shade of a great cottonwood tree. There are 9 of them. Some are the children of farmers from Cedar Hollow. 2 are the grandchildren of men who once laughed at Verena Holloway in a land office. One of them, a serious-eyed boy of 10, named after his grandfather, is the grandson of the man who had been Silas Drennan's clerk in the year 1889. The boy's mother had brought him out the previous spring and asked Verena if her son might come and learn from her about the soil. Verena had said yes without hesitation. The mother had cried. Verena had not. In the center of the half circle, a woman sits in a plain wooden chair. She is 57 years old. Her hair is the color of old iron, almost silver now at the temples. Her hands are weathered and strong. She is dressed in a faded blue work dress and a long gray apron with deep pockets. There are seeds in one pocket and a small leather notebook in the other. She is talking to the children about how to read the color of soil after the spring rain. Beside her chair, lying on the cool grass in the shade, is an enormous old mule. His coat is nearly pure white now. His muzzle is gray. His eyes are half closed in the sun. He has not pulled a cart in 2 years. He spends his days in the shade of the cottonwood tree, watching whatever Verena watches sleeping, when she lets the children answer their own questions. A small girl in the habit raises her hand. Mrs. Pike. Yes, Sarah.
Were you ever scared when you came here? By yourself, with the men trying to hurt you? Verena smiles. She looks past the children at the spring at the foot of the bluff. The water shimmers in the late afternoon light, the same silver blue she had seen on her first evening 23 years before. Every day, child, she says softly. Every single day for more than 20 years. The children are quiet. Courage is not the absence of fear, she says. My aunt taught me that. Courage is the decision to keep planting anyway. To put one seed in the ground, and then another, and then another. Even when you are sure that the night is going to come and take it all away, you put the seed in the ground, you give it water, and you let the land do what the land has always done. She looks down at Jericho. The old mule's ribs rise once. Slowly, they fall. They do not rise again. Verena does not move for a long moment. Then she reaches down and lays her weathered hand on the white neck of the mule who had carried her last possessions out of one life and into another, who had drunk from a spring that the valley said was cursed, who had walked beside her every step from a rainy graveyard to this shaded cottonwood and this circle of children in a healed valley. Her eyes fill. They do not spill. Children, she says quietly. Class is finished for today. The children, sensing something they do not entirely understand, but feel all the way down, get up slowly and quietly and gather their things. They walk back toward the road in a small, respectful line. The serious-eyed boy at the back of the line looks once over his shoulder. Then he turns and follows the others. Verena Pike sits alone in the wooden chair under the cottonwood tree. She keeps her hand on Jericho's neck. The spring keeps flowing at the foot of the bluff. Somewhere up in the cedars, a whippoorwill begins to call, though it is not yet evening. The valley is quiet. The land is green. The water sings over the pale stone as it has sung for 10,000 years, and as it will sing for 10,000 more. And on the high ground above the spring,
Two stone markers stand side by side in the long grass. Two Threlkeld sisters who waited a long time to be together and who finally are.
The widow who bought a haunted farm for $15 closes her eyes in the warm sun. She has kept every promise she ever made.